Hello and welcome back to Restore 2023 and the book of Isaiah. We're in chapters 33 and 34 today, and the context for this passage is the last minute turning to the Lord under Hezekiah, with the Assyrian army of Sennacherib at the very gates of Jerusalem. Isaiah promises that the city will be delivered from this immediate threat, but also that it will ultimately be delivered and blessed on the future day of the Lord. On that day, the Lord will once again be recognized by his people as king, and he will cause them to dwell in peace and security. Now, the destroyer and betrayer mentioned in chapter 33 is almost certainly Assyria, although they are for the time being the instrument of God's judgment on other nations. Their turn will come. Isaiah prays for this divine justice in verses 2 to 9. They are described as treacherous because they accepted Hezekiah's tribute and then besieged Jerusalem anyway in 701 BC. Isaiah later tells us that this treachery is punished in kind, as Sennacherib was slain by his own sons on his return to Nineveh. The betrayer is betrayed and the destroyer destroyed. But for the moment, verses 7 to 9 of chapter 33 describe the horrors of an occupied land and a city under siege. Travel is impossible, the fields and farms are devastated, and those who worked hard for peace have their dreams shattered. But Isaiah assures the people of Judah that there is hope. Verses 17 to 19 of chapter 33 predict a time when the occupation will end and the people of Judah will no longer fear the Assyrian officials who dominate and control their lives. The king in verse 17 is none other than the Lord himself. Now, he has been king all along, but the people will finally recognize him as such. In other parts of his book, Isaiah clearly foretells a human Messiah, the fulfillment of the Davidic line, but here the focus is on the Lord himself reigning as king. From our perspective, post-incarnation, we can see how this tension is resolved in the person of Jesus, the one who is both the final, perfect Davidic king and the Lord himself. Verse 23 returns us to Isaiah's contemporary situation, where Judah is presented as a damaged ship, completely unprepared to deal with Assyria. But then in verse 24, the prophet's vision zooms back into the messianic future. And this focus on the future day of the Lord continues throughout chapter 4, where Isaiah predicts the judgments that will accompany the last days. The heavenly disturbances mentioned here are also repeated by Jesus in Mark 13 and by John in Revelation 6. You might wonder why Edom is mentioned here, given that Isaiah was talking about Assyria in the previous chapter. Well, that's because this part of Isaiah's prophecy isn't focused primarily on current events, but the far future instead. So Edom is therefore symbolic of all God's enemies, as Babylon is in Revelation. The destruction that is visited on these enemies makes difficult reading for us today. The chaos and desolation promised in verse 11 of chapter 34 are the same Hebrew words used in Genesis to describe the pre-creation state of the earth as formless and void. So what is happening here at the end of days is an act of uncreation. In order to make all things new, the heavenly king will one day unmake those parts of his creation that continue to stubbornly oppose him.